Okay, let's look at one last feature for this week, something called methods. I've got two method calls on line 3 and line 8. As you can see, the method calls are similar to function calls in that we have a name followed by parentheses and then what look like arguments, and in fact they are. Replace is a string method, and count is also a string method. Methods are type-specific functions. What that means is that a method that you call on a particular object type is unique to that type, usually. Replace and count are string methods. They're being called on a string variable or string object. You can see that var points to a string object. So when we say var.replace, what we're doing is calling a string method. Now there are certain specific string methods that are available. In the coming weeks, we'll look at methods that belong to other object types. This week, we'll just look at string methods. I hope you can see what's happening if you stare at it when we call replace on the string hello world and we pass two arguments, world and Mars. It should be relatively clear that when you print var2 and you see hello Mars, that what the replace method has done is take the string world, replace it with mars, and produce a new string with the replacement made. You can see that the new string is exactly the same except for the replacement. And this is what the replace method does. So when we learn about several of these methods this week, you're going to be able to apply the same logic that you applied to functions. That is, that there may be arguments and there may be return values from these methods in the same way that there are arguments to functions and return values from functions. In the second example, you can see we're calling a method called count. Now, what type does var2 look like to you? Well, I don't know if you can tell by just staring at it, although it is saying it in the comment, but what count does is take a string argument and look for that string argument to see how many times it appears in the original string, that is the string upon which we're calling count. We like to say that we call count on the string object, var. So what do you think the 3 is about? Well, if you stare at it long enough, you'll realize that hello world has 3 L's in it. And that's why we're getting back a 3. And given that's a count, do you imagine what type var2 is? var2 is an integer. Now, why is it an integer? Well, for the same reason that any of the other types, any of the other functions that you've seen return a particular type. The methods just work that way. Replace is designed to return a string. Count is designed to return an integer. If you compare the syntax between a function and a method, you can see it's pretty darn close. Here we're getting the length of Meister, and then we're also counting the number of L's in Meister. Len is a function, and it consists syntactically of a name followed by parentheses, and then an argument, if appropriate, in the function call. The method is exactly the same, except it's called after a dot and after a string object. We again can say that count is a string method. Now the difference in syntax between these two should make it clear to you what you're looking at when you see a name followed by parentheses. If it's a freestanding name with parentheses after it, it's a function call. If it's a name after a dot with parentheses after it, then it's a method call. Again, methods are type-specific functions. That is, you wouldn't have a count method in a string. You wouldn't have a replace method you wouldn't have a count method or a replace method in an integer or a float. That doesn't really make sense for integers and floats. But it does make sense for a string because one of the things that Python is really good at is string manipulation. So methods are type-specific functions. They're called on the strings, and they operate on or read from the string. You can see that replace is replacing world with Mars in var. Count is counting the number of L's in var. Count here is counting the number of capital L's in Meister. And that's the meaning of a method. It's almost like a behavior for the object. It's a specific kind of string-like behavior. And so, of course, like other things, it is dependent on the type to work properly.